Hey folks, or pod people, or whatever your preferred nomenclature is, welcome once again to Mad Cardigan Crime. I'm your host Brian, and I am so glad you could join me tonight, since I most emphatically don't want to talk about this shit all alone. Okay, podcast checklist time. Cardigan? Check. Double whiskey? Check. Bucket of KFC? No. With their previous choices in management, I may never eat it again. And that is a fucking shame, as my waistline can attest. I love the Colonel. In this slimy episode, we are going to meet a very handsy handyman, a sociopath who was so deceiving and duplicitous, he was perfectly made for the politics that he was so fond of. Lastly, he was a man who was so into his Halloween costume that he actually had a hand in ruining what was for most of us a beloved childhood icon, the clown. I'm pretty sure Stephen King's It was also responsible, but this guy fucking started it. Everybody, wash your hands afterwards. This is John Wayne Gacy. Now that he's wandered off to the buffet table, we can talk about him behind his back. Mindy, stop staring. Okay, just to set the scene before we begin, I want you to do me a favor. There's a pretty well-known mugshot of Gacy where he has this shitty little grin on his face. Keep in mind that at the time of this photo, Gacy had murdered more than 30 people and raped countless more. I've read that in this photo, he is actually laughing at one of his own jokes. This should give you the measure of the man we will be discussing. If you're able, keep this picture up and glance at it throughout the podcast. I've obviously never been a fan of Gacy, but by the end, you'll want to rip up this photo and piss on it. Make sure it's not on your phone at the time. So without further ado, we're off to the city of cubs, bears, bulls, and straying from the animal themes, Blackhawks, which I'm pretty sure are actually Native Americans, but if not, then all you anthropologists calm the hell down. Chicago. You're out of there. Now, let's start where we usually do, where the reptile was hatched. As the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robison, John Wayne Gacy was born at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942. Gacy was born to Polish and Danish parents and raised in a Catholic family. His father was a machinist in the auto repair industry and a World War I veteran, and his mother was a homemaker. You know, it's funny that Gacy's parents were John and Marion. He was named for his father's most manly hero. But the actor John Wayne, his actual first name was Marion. I love useless trivia. Now, despite being close to his mother and two sisters, Gacy had a difficult relationship with his father, who was an alcoholic, and he verbally and physically abused them. The elder Gacy frequently belittled his son, calling him dumb and stupid, and comparing him unfavorably with his sisters. One of Gacy's earliest childhood memories was of his father beating him at age 4 for accidentally disarranging car engine components. His mother tried to shield her son from his father's abuse, which resulted in accusations that he was a sissy and a mama's boy, who would probably grow up queer. Gacy's father had only one son, and he was so absorbed with him being manly. It seemed that he knew early on that Gacy was going to let him down in that department. This created a hugely negative upbringing. In 1949, Gacy's father whipped him after he and another boy were caught sexually fondling a young girl. The same year, a family friend began to occasionally molest Gacy. Gacy never told his father, afraid that he would actually take the blame for it. Despite their challenging relationship, Gacy loved his father, but he felt he was never good enough in his father's eyes. Gacy was an overweight and unathletic child. Because of a heart condition, he was told to avoid sports. In the 4th grade, Gacy began to experience blackouts. He was hospitalized on occasion because of these episodes, and also in 1957 for a burst appendix. Gacy later estimated that between the ages of 14 and 18, he had spent almost a year in hospital. He attributed the decline of his grades to missing school. Gacy's medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed. His father suspected he was malingering, On one occasion, he openly accused his son of faking as he lay in a hospital bed. Outside of a sickly childhood in which he was continuously belittled and compared to his sisters, nothing much of note happened. I believe sometime during his sexual development he realized he was gay. This would not have been a topic for discussion, given his father's attitude and the time period in which they lived. Now, in 1960, at age 18, Gacy became involved in politics for the first time, working as an assistant precinct captain for a local Democratic Party candidate. This led to more criticism from his father, who called him a patsy. The same year, Gacy's father bought him a car. Now, he kept the vehicle's title in his own name until the younger Gacy had paid for it, which took several years. His father would confiscate the keys if Gacy did not do as he said. So, even in adulthood, his father found ways to control and emasculate him. In April 1962, Gacy purchased an extra set of keys in response. His father removed the distributor cap, keeping the component for 3 days. Hours after his father replaced that cap, Gacy left home and drove to Las Vegas, Nevada. He had $136 to his name, and he had the hope of residing with a cousin. Gacy worked in the Las Vegas ambulance service before being transferred to Palm Mortuary. He worked as a mortuary attendant for 3 months, observing morticians embalming bodies and occasionally serving as a pallbearer. He slept on a cot behind the embalming room and later confessed that one evening, while alone, he clambered into the coffin of a teenage male, embracing and caressing the body before experiencing a sense of shock. This experience prompted Gacy to return home. Now, this is the first mention of both homosexuality and necrophilia combined. He was showing a desensitization to death. Shortly thereafter, Gacy enrolled at Northwestern Business College despite having failed to complete high school. He graduated in 1963 and took a management trainee position with the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company. In 1964, the company transferred him to Springfield, Illinois to work as a salesman and eventually promoted him to department manager. He always loved being in charge. In March of that year, he became engaged to Marilyn Myers, a co-worker. This would be the beginning of Gacy's false life. His intense desire to impress his father by having a normal relationship and family forced him to make this facade. During their courtship, Gacy joined the local chapter of JC's. That same year, he had his second homosexual experience. According to Gacy, a colleague in the JC's plied him with drinks and invited him to spend the evening on his sofa. The colleague then performed oral sex on him while he was drunk. By 1965, Gacy had risen to the position of vice president of the Springfield JC's and was named the third most outstanding JC in Illinois. Now we come to the desecration of KFC. Gacy and Myers married in September of 1964. Marilyn's father subsequently purchased 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Now you're starting to understand my introduction. The couple moved there so Gacy could manage the restaurants with the understanding that they would move into Marilyn's parents' former home. The offer was fantastic for the time. Gacy would receive $15,000 per year, which is the equivalent of about $150,000 as of 2024, plus a share of the restaurant's profits. He also got to relabel the KFCs to Kinks Fondling Children. Gacy opened a club in his basement where his employees could drink alcohol and play pool. Although Gacy employed teenagers of both sexes, he socialized only with the males. Gacy gave many of them alcohol before he made sexual advances. If they rebuffed him, he would claim his advances were jokes or a test of morals. His financial and professional situation now allowed Gacy to construct his own hunting preserve, for lack of a better term. Gacy's wife gave birth to a son in February 1966 and a daughter in March 1967. Gacy later described this period of his life as perfect. He had finally earned his father's approval. When Gacy's parents visited in July 1966, his father privately apologized for the abuse he had inflicted on before happily saying, "Son, I was wrong about you." He shook Gacy's hand. This was the pinnacle of Gacy's young life, and it was entirely based on a lie, and Gacy knew it perfectly well. Gacy joined the local JC's chapter in Waterloo. When it came to recognition and being in charge, he was a very hard worker. At meetings, Gacy often provided fried chicken and insisted on being called Colonel. He and other Waterloo JCs were also deeply involved in drug abuse, pornography, prostitution, and wife swapping. Pretty much the typical shit that goes on in an unsupervised boys' club. Although Gacy was considered ambitious and a braggart, the JCs held him in high regard for his fundraising work. In 1967, he was named Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo JCs and served on the board of directors. Now, Gacy's first documented assault. His position in the community was making him overly confident, and it came back to bite him big time. This would be his first hard lesson in covering his tracks. In August 1967, Gacy sexually assaulted 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, Jr., the son of Donald Edwin Voorhees, a local politician and fellow JC. Gacy lured Voorhees to his house with the promise of showing him heterosexual stag films regularly played at JC events. Gacy plied Voorhees with alcohol, allowed him to watch a stag movie, then persuaded him to engage in mutual oral sex, adding, "You have to have sex with a man before you start having sex with women." Now, this would be a continuing justification Gacy would use on his victims. He would reason that the sex act was the same no matter the gender of the partner. When it involves consenting adults, that's probably true. When it's used to coerce children, it's the ploy of a monster. Over the following months, Gacy abused several other youths, including one whom he encouraged to have sex with his own wife before blackmailing him into performing oral sex on him. In his own enterprising fashion, Gacy tricked several teenagers into believing he was commissioned to conduct homosexual experiments for scientific research and paid them up to $50 each. In March 1968, Voorhees told his father that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. Voorhees Sr. immediately informed the police, who arrested Gacy and charged him with performing oral sodomy on Voorhees and the attempted assault of 16-year-old Edward Lynch. Gacy vehemently denied the charges and demanded to take a polygraph test. In an egotistical mind like his, where his reputation was held above all else, he could actually believe he could beat the test. The results of the test were indicative of deception. No shit. Gacy then switched on the sociopath and did what all poor little me people do when proven a liar: publicly deny any wrongdoing and insist the charges were politically motivated. It seems Voorhees Sr. had opposed Gacy's nomination for appointment as president of the Iowa JCs. Several fellow JCs found Gacy's story credible and rallied to his support. However, on May 10, 1968, Gacy was indicted on the sodomy charge. Now, as a perfect example of when self-absorbed idiots double down on their mistakes, Gacy promised one of his employees, 18-year-old Russell Schroeder, $300 if he would beat up Voorhees in an effort to discourage the boy from testifying in court. Schroeder lured Voorhees to an isolated park, sprayed mace in his eyes, and then beat him. Voorhees escaped and reported Schroeder's action to police. Schroeder was arrested the next day and promptly implicated Gacy. I'm shocked this plan to hire a teenager didn't work out better. Gacy was arrested and charged with the additional crime. On September 12th, Gacy was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at the psychiatric hospital of the University of Iowa. 2 doctors concluded he had an antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for sociopathy and/or psychopathy, and he was unlikely to benefit from treatment, and that this behavior pattern was likely to bring him in repeated conflict with society. So they basically described every politician and CEO before they screw up enough to get caught. Gacy was, however, deemed mentally competent to stand trial. On November 7, 1968, Gacy pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy in relation to Voorhees, but not guilty to the charges related to other youths. He claimed Voorhees had offered himself to him and that he had acted out of curiosity. His story was not believed. Gacy was convicted of sodomy on December 3rd and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment to be served at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. That same day, Gacy's wife petitioned for divorce, requesting she be awarded the couple's home and property, sole custody of their 2 children, and alimony. The court ruled in her favor, and the divorce was finalized on September 18, 1969. Gacy never saw his first wife or children again. During his incarceration, Gacy rapidly acquired a reputation as a model prisoner. Within months of his arrival, he had risen to the position of head cook. He also joined the inmate JC chapter and increased its membership from 50 to 650 in less than 18 months. Gacy secured an increase in the inmates' daily pay in the prison mess hall and supervised several projects to improve conditions for inmates, including the installation of a miniature golf course, which is what all prisoners deserve. He was presented with a Distinguished Service Award for his efforts within the inmate JC chapter in February of 1970. In June of 1969, Gacy was denied parole. To prepare for a second scheduled parole hearing in May 1970, he completed 16 high school courses, obtaining his diploma in November 1969. On Christmas Day 1969, Gacy's father died from cirrhosis. When informed of his father's death, Gacy collapsed on the floor sobbing. His request for supervised compassionate leave to attend the funeral was denied. Now, as bad as his father was, I think he was the only person that Gacy would subconsciously check his behavior for. Now his only obstacle to becoming a truly shameless monster was gone. The triumphant return to Chicago. In a horrible fuck-up by our prison system, the child molester Gacy was granted parole, having served a shameful 18 months of his 10-year sentence. Conditions of his probation included a nightly curfew and that Gacy relocate to Chicago to live with his mother. Gacy told the fellow JC that picked him up when released that he would never go back to jail. Quite a prophetic statement, as we'll see. In his typical delusionary windbag style, he also told the man that he intended to reestablish himself in Waterloo. However, once he left the man's car and was alone, reality set in, and within 24 hours, Gacy had relocated to Chicago. The once big shot rolled in on a bus on June 19th and started his glamorous new job as a short-order cook. Now, we'll see 2 shining examples of how badly our justice system functioned before the advent of computers. On February 12, 1971, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy who claimed that he had lured him into his car at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal and driven him to his home, where he had attempted to force the boy into sex. The court dismissed this complaint when the boy failed to appear. On June 22nd, Gacy was arrested and charged with aggravated sexual battery and reckless conduct in response to a complaint filed by a youth who claimed that Gacy had flashed a sheriff's badge, lured him into his car, and forced him to perform oral sex. These charges were dropped after the complainant attempted to blackmail Gacy. Today, either one of these arrests would have immediately been discovered as a parole violation, and Gacy would have gone back to prison to serve the remaining 8.5 years of his sentence at least. When you hear the destruction Gacy will wreak in that time frame as we continue, you'll be amazed at the amount of lives that could have been saved. Instead, the Iowa Board of Parole did not learn of these incidents. Gacy's parole ended on October 18, 1971, and a month later, the records of Gacy's criminal convictions in Iowa were sealed. Amazing. Building the foundation of death. Now, this whole fiasco of fuck-ups and a much too short stint in jail had done nothing to improve or rehabilitate Gacy. In fact, most experts agree that serial predators, murderers, pedophiles, and the like cannot be rehabilitated where their primary motivation is sex. If I told one of you consenting adults out there with a normal sex drive to stop liking your preferred sexual partner when I snap my fingers or you're going to jail, you'd probably try to snap that finger off and shove it up my ass before going on a Thelma and Louise type run from the law. Come to think of it, you may belong behind bars. Now take your normal sex drive and multiply it many, many times over, and you have most serial sex offenders. Think about it. If you have a serial robber whose only motivation is money, and then you give him more money than he can spend, boom, his drive to rob is taken away and he is rehabilitated. Now, since providing Gacy with all the underage boys he can molest is not a viable option, his drive cannot be taken away. Minus the murder, which Gacy only did to remove witnesses, he would have fared well in ancient Rome. A turd out of his own time, I guess. So, Gacy decided he wanted to go back to his old life of having a lair to bring his prey to. With Mommy's help, he bought a ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in unincorporated Norwalk Park Township, Illinois, which is part of metropolitan Chicago. He lived there until his arrest in December 1978, and, according to Gacy, committed all his murders there. You'll soon see that this house was literally built on the dead. Also in his old style, and since no one here knew what a monstrous asshole he was, Gacy began to look for recognition and adoration wherever he could. He was active in his local community and gleefully helped out his neighbors. He even plowed snow from neighborhood walks for fun. What a guy. And honestly, in the northern states, someone clearing the neighborhood walks of snow was kind of a big deal. From 1974 to 1978, he hosted themed annual summer parties. These events were attended by up to 400 people, including politicians and business associates. I've seen some photos from these parties, including some where Gacy is dressed as a cowboy. Spoiler alert, he does not look like John Wayne. Rest in peace, Duke. Now to his second marriage and divorce. In August 1971, shortly after Gacy and his mother moved into the house, he became engaged to Carol Hoff, whom he had briefly dated in high school. Carol and her two young daughters from a previous marriage moved into the house soon after. They were married on July 1, 1972. Gacy's mother moved out of the house shortly before the wedding. By 1975, Gacy has told his wife that he was bisexual. After the couple had sex on Mother's Day that year, he informed her that this would be the last time they would do so. He began spending most evenings away from home, only to return in the early morning with the excuse he'd been working late or conducting business meetings. Carol observed Gacy bringing teenage boys into his garage in the early hours and also found gay pornography and men's wallets with identifications inside the house. When she confronted Gacy about these items, he informed her angrily that this was none of her business. My wife once found a longer than normal hair on the passenger seat of my car. When I angrily informed her that it was none of her business, she kicked me in the balls. And that doesn't seem fair. I'm of course just kidding, that hair was in the back seat. In October 1975, after a heated argument, Carol asked Gacy for a divorce. He agreed, although by mutual consent she continued to live at his house until February 1976. On March 2nd, the Gacy's divorce, decreed on the false grounds of Gacy's infidelity with women, was finalized. Wouldn't even admit homosexuality on an official court document. PDM contractors. In 1971, Gacy established a part-time construction business, PDM Contractors, for painting, decorating, and maintenance, or as we will forevermore refer to it, pricks diddling minors. With the approval of his probation officer, Gacy worked evenings on his construction contracts while working as a cook during the day. Initially, he undertook minor repair work, but later expanded to include projects such as interior design, remodeling, and landscaping. In mid-1973, Gacy quit his job as a cook so he could commit fully to his construction business. By 1975, PDM was expanding rapidly and Gacy was working up to 16 hours per day. In March 1977, he became a supervisor for PE Systems, which was a firm specializing in the remodeling of drugstores. Between PE Systems and PDM, Gacy worked on up to 4 projects simultaneously and frequently traveled to other states. By 1978, PDM's annual revenue was over $200,000. Here come the clowns. Through his membership in a local moose club, Gacy became aware of a Jolly Joker clown club, whose members regularly performed at fundraising events and parades, in addition to voluntarily entertaining hospitalized children. In late 1975, Gacy joined the clown club. Everyone who knows Gacy knows his character Pogo the Clown. That is who most people associate with Gacy's clown paintings in prison. What some don't know is that he also made up Patches the Clown, who he described as a more serious character. Since Gacy's clown paintings were done after he was convicted of slaughtering 33 people, I think they were actually representing Patches the serious clown. Gacy seldom earned money from his performances, and later said that acting as a clown allowed him to regress into childhood. Now, since by all accounts Gacy hated his childhood, it seems that's the last place he would want to go. I think the more likely reason is the same reason most damaged people hide their identities: displacement and the ability to act as he wanted without taking responsibility for anything as a human. Think back, probably to your childhood, and remember the last time you wore a mask that hid your identity. Then you came into contact with friends who didn't know it was you, maybe a Halloween party or something similar. Now remember that slight excitement you felt, knowing you could act as you wished in front of people you knew and they wouldn't hold you responsible. Now, take that feeling and have the devil hump it to death. That's probably only a tenth of the intensity Gacy felt. Later on, when talking to police, Gacy even elaborated on this feeling. He said, "When at a children's party, you can have a woman sit on your lap as a clown and feel her up without complaint. Clowns can get away with anything. Clowns can get away with murder." Now, he performed as both Pogo and Patches at numerous local parties, political functions, charitable events, and children's hospitals, God help us. Gacy's voluntary public service as a clown throughout the years of his murders led him to being known as the Killer Clown. As a side note about Gacy's psychology, when you picture an image of the standard clown in your head, how do you envision the makeup? I see kind of circular, soft edges around the eyes and mouth, not to mention the completely round, red nose. Gacy's makeup totally consisted of sharp, pointy edges that at a passing glance seem innocent, probably because of their bright colors. Pay closer attention to that same face, and it's more akin to a skull or demon. And the funniest part of this whole thing is, Gacy probably had no idea he was doing it. Now we move on to stocking his depraved pantry. Just as when Gacy had been the colonel of KFC, he started staffing PDM with his preferred prey, high school students and young men. Gacy would often proposition his workers for sex or insist on sexual favors in return for lending his vehicles, financial assistance, or promotions. After the abuses were committed, if Gacy felt the need, he would make threats, as he did with Donald Voorhees Jr. years ago. Gacy would claim to own guns, once telling an employee, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and kill you?" Or how easy it would be to get rid of the body. So up until this point, Gacy was still just relying on his coercion skills to satisfy his sexual urges. If his initial proposition was rejected by the young man, Gacy would pretend he was just joking and usually move on. After he abused a victim, he would rely on veiled threats and shame to cover his tracks. In the back of his mind, even someone as dense as Gacy had to realize that eventually his luck would run out, like in Waterloo. Even though Gacy would murder 2 young men during this span, these next few instances probably cemented in his mind the need not to leave witnesses. The 2 murders that he did commit were very early in his career. They were not well planned, and he didn't have the process of disposal perfected yet. In 1973, Gacy had a teenage employee referred to in literature as Jackson. His real name was withheld. I initially tried to research his real name and then realized even if I found it, I wouldn't mention it here. So Gacy and Jackson traveled to Florida to view a property Gacy had purchased. While there, Gacy raped Jackson in their hotel room. Gacy was probably completely ignorant of this, but since he transported that minor across state lines for immoral purposes, he had stepped knee-deep into federal crime, or federally fucked as they say. Now, as most of you have probably seen in movies, the FBI always has jurisdictional problems. I mean, the layperson would think that the FBI could handle all crime, but imagine the manpower it would take to accomplish that. So, rape, murder, and the like are usually handled by local and state authorities. One possible exception to this is when the investigation has reached a state level and it's beyond their capabilities still. The FBI's assistance can then be requested, but it's not always granted. Now, having said that, if you really want their assistance, have a dumbass criminal cross a state line in the commission of the crime. Then the green light is given for the federal government to crawl straight up their ass. Now, had Gacy not ultimately handed local authorities a slam dunk case that an infant could have prosecuted, the FBI could have gone back to this Ohio to Florida crime and put Gacy away forever if they wanted. Trust me, if they had an unprovable case against a serial killer and their only provable offense was jaywalking, he would ultimately get the chair. Now back to his Florida victim. After returning to Chicago, Jackson drove to Gacy's house and beat the shit out of him in his own front yard. Gacy's mother-in-law actually had to intervene to stop this beating. I'm sure in years to come, she actually wishes she would have joined in instead. Now that would have made an interesting art piece. Gacy being stomped in his front yard by a child and an old lady. Anyway, he ended up telling his wife he had been attacked for refusing to pay Jackson for poor quality painting work. Now, I'm sure there are some of you adventurous people out there who enjoy this type of pain, but I can assure you, Gacy does not belong to your club. The second instance was in May 1975, when Gacy hired 15-year-old Anthony Antonucci. 2 months later, he went to Antonucci's home, knowing the youth's parents were gone on vacation and that he had an injured foot. He had actually stepped on a nail at work the day before. Keep in mind, Gacy had already made homosexual advances on this boy. These advances had been rejected to the point that Gacy had almost been struck with a chair. Gacy had explained these advances as a test of Antonucci's morals, which he passed. I guess he thought since Antonucci was now hobbled, he would be an easier target. Thankfully, he was wrong. The two drank a bottle of wine, then watched a heterosexual stag film before Gacy wrestled Antonucci to the floor and cuffed his hands behind his back. One cuff was loose, and Antonucci freed his arm while Gacy was in the kitchen looking for God knows what. When Gacy returned, Antonucci, who was a high school wrestler, grappled with him, obtained the key, and cuffed Gacy's hands behind his back. Unsurprisingly, Gacy soon became complacent and promised to leave if he was freed. Antonucci agreed, and Gacy left. In hindsight, Antonucci thought a comment Gacy made was strange. He said that Antonucci was not only the first person to escape the cuffs, but he was also the first to put them on Gacy. How many people had Gacy cuffed prior to this? Antonucci continued working for PDM for 9 months after this incident, and Gacy wisely made no further attempts to assault him. Finally, on July 26, 1976, Gacy picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker David Cram and offered him a job with PDM. He began work the same evening. One time, while working at Gacy's house, he found a young man's ID. He asked Gacy if he could keep it to buy alcohol. In a shining example of Gacy's blowhardedness, he claimed he worked for the syndicate and that he arranged hits on people. That ID belonged to someone he had ordered hit, so Cram wouldn't want it. He said all this shit with a straight face. On August 21st, Cram moved into Gacy's house. The next day, Cram returned to the house drunk and high while celebrating his 19th birthday. He was greeted by Gacy dressed as Pogo, or Patches. After they both drank and smoked some more, Gacy began to perform as a clown, complete with a puppet show. Gacy saved his best act for last. This was, of course, the handcuff trick. Gacy ultimately conned Cram into donning handcuffs, his wrists cuffed in front of his body rather than behind. He swung Cram around while holding the chain link and told him the secret to the handcuff trick: you need the key. Then I imagine he switched from Pogo to Patches, as the next thing out of his mouth was to inform Cram that he was going to rape him. Cram, who had spent a year in the Army, then promptly kicked Gacy in the face, knocking him to the floor and comically smudging his face paint. He then freed himself and locked himself in his room for the rest of the night. I have to think that Cram desperately needed a place to stay after this, and even more so because Gacy continued to homosexually pester him. Cram would sleep with jeans on just to have a buffer between him and Gacy during the night. He would even hear Gacy calling to him from his bedroom in a creepy sing-song voice saying, "Dave, you know what I want." That's my best creepy sing-song voice, but I doubt I can hold a candle to Gacy. A month later, Gacy once again appeared at Cram's bedroom door, intending to rape him, saying, "Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you give me what I want." After physically fighting with Gacy, Cram ended up straddling him. Gacy then sulked out of the room, stating, "You ain't no fun." Cram finally had enough and moved out on October 5th. He also quit PDM, although he periodically worked for Gacy over the following 2 years. Shortly afterwards, another employee, 18-year-old Michael Rossi, moved in. Rossi had worked for PDM since May 23, 1976. He lived with Gacy until April 1977. Rossi seemed to be a more willing participant in Gacy's games. As he was a supervisor in the company, he was considered Gacy's right-hand man. Rossi even sometimes assisted Gacy in clowning at grand openings of businesses. Gacy is Pogo, and Rossi is Patches. Kinda have to wonder if Rossi knew what he was representing. And now on to politics. Gacy entered local Democratic Party politics, initially offering use of his employees to clean party headquarters at no charge. He was rewarded with an invitation to serve on the Norwood Park Township Street Lighting Committee, subsequently earning the title of Precinct Captain. In 1975, Gacy was appointed director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade. Through his work with the parade, which he would supervise until 1978, Gacy met and was photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter, wearing an S pin indicating a person given special clearance. This event later became an embarrassment to the Secret Service. And now we come to the murders. We know that John Gacy committed at least 33 murders, but the details of all of the murders are not available. I'll cover as many of them as I can find because Gacy was not good about giving up details. Some of these are speculation by the police. Many of Gacy's victims to this day have not been identified, even though there have been some recent successes using DNA to identify, some of the victims that have remained nameless over the decades. After all the huge mistakes Gacy had made in his already impressive criminal career, he was now about to ramp up to the most heinous act possible, murder. Now, as far as classifications go, Gacy was somewhat of a hybrid between a product and a process killer. I believe Gacy was a sadist, and he enjoyed harming the victims, but I don't think he actually enjoyed the process of killing. I think the murders just served the purpose of disposing of witnesses. So the disposal of witnesses was the product in this case. Gacy's first known murder occurred on January 3, 1972. According to Gacy's later account, following a family party the previous evening, he drove to the Civic Center in the Loop in the early morning to view a display of ice sculptures. He then lured 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy from Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal into his car. McCoy was on his way to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska, and informed Gacy his bus was not due until noon. Gacy took McCoy on a sightseeing tour of Chicago, then drove him to his home with the promise that he could spend the remainder of the night and be driven back to the station in time to catch the bus. Prior to McCoy's identification, he was known as the Greyhound bus boy. Gacy claimed he woke early the following morning to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway, holding a kitchen knife. He jumped from his bed, and McCoy raised both arms in a gesture of surrender, accidentally cutting Gacy's forearm. Gacy disarmed McCoy, banged his head against the bedroom wall, and kicked him against the wardrobe. McCoy kicked Gacy in the stomach, doubling him over. Gacy then grabbed McCoy, wrestled him to the floor, and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest. As McCoy lay dying, Gacy claimed he washed the knife in his bathroom, then went to his kitchen and saw the makings of breakfast on the table. McCoy had set the table for two. He had walked into Gacy's room to wake him while absent-mindedly carrying a knife. Gacy buried McCoy in his crawl space and later covered his grave with a layer of concrete. In an interview several years after his arrest, Gacy said that immediately after killing McCoy, he felt totally drained, yet noted that as he stabbed McCoy and listened to the gurgulations and gasping, he had experienced a mind-numbing orgasm. He added, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." I may have to rethink this whole process product thing. Touche, Gacy. The explanation for this murder would continue a common theme. Gacy would find explanations that minimized his responsibility. I think a much more likely explanation for what happened was that Gacy attempted to rape this boy by threatening him with a knife or holding a knife on him. This didn't go as he planned, and he ended up having to stab him to death after a struggle. Afterwards, Gacy discovered two things. Because of Gacy's preferred victims, this would always be a coin toss when things went wrong, and using a knife was an incredibly messy way to kill someone. Gacy liked his house tidy, hence the handcuff trick was conceived. The second murder. Gacy said he committed murder for the second time around January 1974. This victim remains unidentified and would remain so because unless Gacy was presented with an identified corpse, he would give up no details. This one was strangled, not stabbed, and placed in Gacy's closet before burial in the crawl space of the house. Gacy later stated that the most memorable part about this murder was that the body's fluids leaked from the victim's mouth and nose, staining his carpet. Gacy regularly stuffed rags, the victim's own underwear, or a sock into the mouths of subsequent victims to prevent such leakage. If he worried about this, imagine the stains McCoy had left. The murder of John Butkovich. On July 31, 1975, John Butkovich, an 18-year-old PDM employee, disappeared. Butkovich's car was later found by his father abandoned with his jacket and wallet inside and the keys in the ignition. So, as John remembers it, Butkovich and two of his friends showed up at his house, with Butkovich threatening to beat him up if he didn't give him some back pay. After talking them out of beating him up, Butkovich and his friends left and John got very high and drunk. Later on, he went out cruising in his car and went to a local gay hangout. There, he located Butkovich again. He told him to get in the car and took him back home. Butkovich was also extremely drunk at this time. Now, when they got back to the house, Butkovich was getting angry again and threatening Gacy over the back pay. John decided to employ his handcuff trick. After talking Butkovich into the handcuffs because he was so drunk, Gacy left him on the floor in the living room and had one of his patented displacement blackout periods. He woke up the next day and found Butkovich dead on the living room floor with a rope around his neck. But of course, Gacy had no idea how the rope got there. Gacy admitted to having no feelings about this and truly said his only thought at the time was at least there was no blood to clean up. The most John ever admitted about this killing during his confessions was that he may have sat on his chest for a bit. Now keep in mind that Gacy's wife was out of town at this time, and so what would he do? Instead of immediately getting rid of the body, he wrapped him in a tarp and stuck him on the floor of the garage. Then his wife comes home early, and now John can't get Butkovich into the crawl space of his house. So he already had a small place on the concrete cleared out, to put a drain in his garage. So he just dug that hole a little bit deeper and stuck Butkovich in it. Then he covered it over with concrete. Problem solved. Now, since Butkovich's father had been part of the reason that he had confronted Gacy over his back pay, he knew that after his son went missing, Gacy was the last person to have seen him. Butkovich's parents contacted the police over 100 times over the years. The police considered Butkovich an adult because he was 17 at the time and treated him as either a runaway or someone who was allowed to go missing if they wished. So after a cursory questioning of Gacy, who admitted to seeing Butkovich and his friends that night, they let the matter lie for years. This is what we refer to as the cruising years. In addition to being the year his business expanded, Gacy freely admitted that 1975 was also when he began to increase the frequency of his excursions for sex with young males. I think the only thing at this time that held him back was the fact that his wife was in the house. After they divorced, Gacy committed the bulk of his 33 murders between 76 and 78. When his victims weren't his own employees, they were often picked up on what he referred to as, once again, cruising trips. Although Gacy remained gregarious and civic-minded, several neighbors noticed behavioral changes after his 1976 divorce, included seeing him keeping company with young males, hearing his car arrive or depart in the early morning, or seeing lights in his home switch on and off in the early hours. One neighbor later recollected that for several years, muffled high-pitched screaming, shouting, and crying had repeatedly awakened her and her son in the early morning. She identified the sounds as emanating from a house adjacent to theirs on West Summerdale Avenue. 1976. Absolutely no respect for our bicentennial year. I'll tell you, but between 76 and 78, I would not want to have a sleepover at John Gacy's house, because with a great many number of victims for which he will take no responsibility, he just woke up in the morning to find them dead in his house. Now, funnily enough, I found that the most concise summary of 1976 and its sketchy details by John Gacy are best described on the Wikipedia page, so I'll paraphrase it. Just listen to this frenzied year. I wish I had the breath capacity to do this in one long sentence for effect. 1 month after his divorce was finalized, Gacy abducted and murdered 18-year-old Darrell Sampson. He was last seen alive in Chicago on April 6, 1976. Gacy buried him under the dining room with cloth lodged in his throat. On May 14th, 15-year-old Randall Reffitt disappeared shortly after returning home from a dental appointment. Hours after Reffitt was last seen by his family, 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton vanished as he walked home from his sister's apartment. He and Reffitt were close acquaintances. They were buried together in the crawl space, and investigators believe the two were murdered the same evening. On June 3rd, Gacy killed 17-year-old Michael Bonin, who disappeared while traveling from Chicago to Waukegan. Gacy strangled Bonin with a ligature and buried him under the spare bedroom. 10 days later, Gacy murdered 16-year-old William Carroll and buried him in a common grave in the crawl space. Carroll seems to have been the first of 4 victims known to have been murdered between June 13th and August 6, 1976. 3 were there between 16 and 17 years old, and one unidentified victim appears to have been an adult. On August 5th, 16-year-old James Hawkinson is last known to have phoned his family, possibly from Gacy's home. Hawkinson died of suffocation. His body was buried in the crawl space beneath 17-year-old Rick Johnson, who was last seen alive on August 6th. Gacy is thought to have murdered 2 unidentified males between August and October 1976. On October 24th, Gacy abducted and killed teenage friends Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino. The 2 were last seen on Clark Street in Chicago. 2 days later, 19-year-old construction worker William Bundy disappeared after informing his family he was to attend a party. Bundy died of suffocation. Gacy buried the body beneath his master bedroom. Bundy had apparently worked for Gacy. Between November and December 1976, Gacy murdered 21-year-old Francis Alexander. His last contact with his family was a phone call to his mother sometime in November. He was not reported missing, as his family believed he had moved to California shortly thereafter. Alexander was buried beneath the room Gacy used as his office. Okay, So after that fucking year, you have a small house in which most of the square footage is sitting on top of rotting human remains. And remember, this is Ohio in the 70s. The crawl space of Gacy's low-lying house would be regularly flooded, so it was in an almost constant state of mud and muck. Finishing up 1976 and starting 1977, we'll cover a young man named Gregory Godzik, who was one of approximately 5 victims that Gacy provided any details about. Not that he admitted to killing anyone, it was never his fault, but it was usually more about the burials and how he disposed of the remains. So 17-year-old Gregory Godzik disappeared and was last seen by his girlfriend outside her house. Godzik had worked for PDM for less than 3 weeks when he disappeared. He had informed his family that Gacy had him dig trenches of some kind for drain tiles in his crawl space. Godzik's car was later found abandoned. Is this sounding familiar? His parents and older sister contacted Gacy about Godzik's disappearance. Gacy claimed that Godzik had expressed a wish to run away from home. He also claimed to have received an answering machine message from Godzik shortly after he disappeared. When asked if he could play the message for the Godzik's parents, Gacy said he had erased it. Now, during his confession, as Gacy remembers it, Godzik was at his home, supposedly there to smoke weed and drink with Gacy. At some point, they got into an argument over Godzik not providing the weed that he was supposed to. After one of John's patented blackout sessions, to which he remembers nothing, he awoke in the morning to find Godzik in a seated position with a rope around his neck, wearing nothing but his underwear. Once again, Gacy took no responsibility for this murder and just stated that he buried Godzik in the crawl space, still in the seated position because the rigor mortis had set in. I've mentioned in an earlier podcast how in the early days of law enforcement back in the 70s and 80s, departments didn't speak with each other. Different states and counties and stuff like that. In this case, however, both Butkovich's parents and Godzik's parents were repeatedly calling the same police department, but they were calling different stations in the same police department. In large cities, their police departments aren't at one central location. They are broken up into different sections, like you hear about precincts in New York. So Butkovich's parents were calling Police Area 6, while Godzik's parents were calling Police Area 5. For whatever reason, these two divisions don't regularly speak to each other without consent or without reason. And so, even though Gacy's name was involved in both of these cases, no one was connected at this time. Now, we move into 1977 and the frenzy continues. So, here we go. On January 20th, 1977, Gacy lured 19-year-old John Zick into his house on the pretext of buying his Plymouth Satellite. He later confessed to strangling Zick in his spare bedroom, claiming Rossi was asleep in the house the following morning. Remember Rossi, the right-hand man we mentioned earlier? Gacy later sold the car to Rossi for $300. 2 months later, on March 15th, 20-year-old John Prestage disappeared. Prestage was last seen leaving a north side restaurant. He was buried in the crawl space above the body of Francis Alexander. Shortly before his disappearance, Prestage had mentioned he had obtained work with a local contractor. Gacy murdered one additional unidentified youth and buried him in the crawl space in the spring or early summer of 1977. On July 5th, Gacy killed 19-year-old Matthew Bowman. Bowman's mother last saw him at a suburban train station. He had intended to travel to Harwood Heights for a court appointment. The following month, Rossi was arrested for stealing gasoline while driving Zick's car. The gas station attendant noted the license plate, and police traced the car to Gacy's house. When questioned, Gacy told officers that Zick had sold the car to him in February, saying he needed money to leave town. A check of the VIN confirmed the car did belong to Zick. The police did not pursue the matter further, although they did inform Zick's mother that her son had sold his car. I'm sure that was very helpful. By the end of 1977, Gacy had murdered 6 more young men between the ages of 16 and 21. The first of these was 18-year-old Robert Gilroy, the son of a Chicago police sergeant, last seen alive on September 15th. Gilroy lived just 4 blocks from the Gacy house. He was buried in the crawl space. On September 12th, Gacy had flown to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to supervise a remodeling project and didn't return to Chicago until September 16th. Because Gacy was in another state at the time Gilroy was last seen, this is cited to support Gacy's claim of assistance from one or more accomplices, maybe Rossi, in several homicides. As horrible as it seems, it's not unheard of for serial killers to enlist the help of immature people in their crimes. Off the top of my head, Dean Corll, the Candyman, comes to mind. We may cover him in another episode. Anyway, 10 days later after Gilroy was last seen, 19-year-old former U.S. Marine John Mowry disappeared after leaving his mother's house. Gacy strangled Mowry and buried his body beneath the master bedroom. On October 17th, 21-year-old Russell Nelson disappeared. He was last seen outside a Chicago bar. Nelson was looking for contracting work. Gacy murdered and buried him beneath the guest bedroom. Less than 4 weeks later, Gacy murdered 16-year-old Robert Winch and buried him in the crawl space. 20-year-old Tommy Bowling disappeared on November 18th after leaving a Chicago bar. On December 9th, 19-year-old U.S. Marine David Talsma disappeared after telling his mother he was to attend a rock concert in Hammond, Indiana. Gacy strangled Tulsa with a ligature and buried him in the crawl space close to John Mowry. Now, just to sneak one more assault in before the new year, on December 30th, Gacy abducted 19-year-old college student Robert Donnelly from a Chicago bus stop at gunpoint while impersonating a cop. Anybody spotting the escalation or possibly desperation here? Gacy drove him to his home, where he raped and tortured him in various ways. Gacy pointed a gun at his head and pulled the trigger over a dozen times until it finally went off. It was obviously a blank. He manually strangled him to unconsciousness multiple times and then drowned Donnelly to unconsciousness in a bathtub 4 times as he made statements such as, "Aren't we playing fun games tonight?" Physical and mental sadism at its best. Donnelly later testified at trial that he was in such pain that he asked Gacy to kill him Gacy replied, "I'm getting around to it." After several hours, Gacy drove Donnelly to his workplace and released him, warning him that if he complained to the police, they would not believe him. I am ashamed to say, at least as far as the authorities were concerned, Gacy was partially right. Gacy was investigated by the police, and he claimed it was a consensual sex slave agreement. The police still pushed for rape and kidnapping charges, but after the prosecutor interviewed Gacy and Donnelly, he ultimately believed Gacy. And this was even with the prosecutor knowing about Gacy's previous sodomy charge. 1978, the last year of the rampage. Next, Gacy killed 19-year-old William Kindred, who disappeared on February 16th after telling his fiancée, who knew Gacy, that he was going to a bar. Kindred was the final victim buried in the crawlspace. For those of you who lost count, there are now 26 decomposing bodies holding Gacy's house up, truly a foundation of death. On March 21st, Gacy lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall into his car. Gacy chloroformed him and drove him to his house, where his arms and head were restrained in a pillory, which is like a medieval stockade device. It was affixed to the ceiling and his feet were locked into another device. He raped and tortured Rignall with instruments including lit candles, whips, and repeatedly chloroformed him into unconsciousness. Gacy then dumped Rignall in Chicago's Lincoln Park, unconscious but alive. Rignall managed to stagger to his girlfriend's apartment. Police were informed of the assault but did not investigate Gacy. Rignall was able to recall the Oldsmobile, the Kennedy Expressway, and particular side streets. He and two friends staked out the Cumberland exit of the expressway, and in April, Rignall saw the Oldsmobile, which he and his friends followed to 8213 West Somerdale. Gacy was arrested on July 15th. He faced trial for assault and battery against Rignall. By mid-1978, the crawlspace had no room for further bodies. Gacy later confessed to police that he considered stowing bodies in his attic, but had been worried about the complications arising from leakage. Therefore, he chose to dispose of his victims off the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River. Gacy stated he had thrown 5 bodies into this river in 1978, one of which he believed had landed on a passing barge. Only 4 of these were ever found. The first known victim thrown from the bridge was 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke. He was murdered in mid-June after leaving his apartment to purchase cigarettes. Shortly before his disappearance, O'Rourke had told his roommate, a contractor on the Northwest Side, had offered him a job. On November 4th, Gacy killed 19-year-old Frank Landingen. He was last seen alive by his father walking along Foster Avenue. His naked body was found close to an inlet in the Des Plaines River by 2 duck hunters on November 12th. On November 24th, 20-year-old James Mazzara disappeared after Thanksgiving dinner with his family. Mazzara had informed his sister the day before that he was working in construction. He was last seen walking in the direction of Bughouse Square. And now, the final act is upon us, the murder of Robert Piest. On the afternoon of December 11th, 1978, Gacy visited the Nissan pharmacy in Des Plaines to discuss a potential remodeling deal with the store owner, Phil Torf. While he was within earshot of 15-year-old part-time employee Robert Piest, Gacy mentioned his firm often hired teenage boys at a starting wage of $5 per hour, almost double the pay Piest earned at the pharmacy. Shortly after Gacy left, Piest's mother arrived at the store to drive her son home so the family could celebrate her birthday together. Piest asked his mother to wait, adding that some contractor wants to talk to me about a job. He left the store at 9 p.m., promising to return shortly. Now, Gacy actually blamed Piest for this abduction, saying that he was just minding his own business in his car when Piest walked up and almost demanded a job from him. So Gacy, being the good guy that he was, told Piest to go ahead and hop in his car and he would drop him off after they discussed the job. Piest was dead less than an hour later at Gacy's home. Gacy later stated that at his house, he gave Piest a soft drink before asking whether there was anything he wouldn't do for the right price, to which Piest replied that he did not mind working hard. In response, Gacy stated good money could be earned by hustling, although Piest was dismissive. Gacy then duped Piest into donning handcuffs. Gacy's subsequent statements regarding these events varied, as they always did, although in one of his initial statements, he claimed Piest failed to resist as he removed the boy's trousers. He also stated that as he placed the rope around Pete's neck, the boy was crying and scared. After placing a tourniquet around Pete's neck, which strangled him without any further help from Gacy, Gacy got a phone call from a business associate he was late for a meeting with. When he finished the phone call, he found Pete's dead body beside the bed and was angry because of the mess he had made when losing control of his bladder. Now, all of this was, of course, speculation by Gacy because he was innocent and blacked out at the time. We'll soon get to Gacy's pathetic alternate personalities who actually committed these horrible crimes. Since the crawl space was now full, Pete would eventually end up in the Des Plaines River by the innocent Gacy. The investigation. Now, to me, personally, the investigation and ultimate capture of Gacy is the most interesting and certainly satisfying part of the entire story. The amount of damage this guy had done over the years for no other reason than to get his own rocks off can boggle a normal mind. Throwing away these boys like they were trash and actually getting a good night's sleep for years on top of their dead bodies, it's crazy. Now I want you to think hard. Have you ever had a child or a sibling that has not even gone missing, but just been out of your sight? You lost track of them for 1 minute, 5 minutes at worst. Remember that pit in your stomach? You remember that feeling? Imagine what these families have been going through with their sons missing for this amount of time, not knowing where they were, but knowing damn well that they had not run away. This piece of shit had caused that over and over again and never gave it a second thought. Well, now he was about to be pursued and hounded by people that hate him as much as you and I do. In other words, prepare to be fucked by the long dick of the law. Now, when Peast failed to return, his family filed a missing persons report with the Des Plaines police. Torf named Gacy as the contractor Peast had most likely left the store to talk to. Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak, whose son attended Maine West High School like Peast, chose to investigate Gacy further. Now, in addition to basically kidnapping a kid in front of witnesses and his own mother, Gacy had drawn the special attention of the police lieutenant. We like to think the police are impartial in everything they do, but they're also human beings. And when this boy, who was approximately the same age as his own son, attending his own son's school, went missing, of course, this guy is going to take special interest. And when you draw the special interest of a police officer and they go above and beyond in everything they do, you are more than likely going to lose, if you're guilty. Now, a check of Gacy's criminal background revealed that he had an outstanding battery charge in Chicago and had been imprisoned in Iowa for sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. Kozenzak and 2 Des Plaines police officers visited Gacy at his home the following evening. Gacy indicated he had asked one of the youths working at the pharmacy, whom he believed to be Peast, whether there were any remodeling materials behind the store. He was adamant, however, that he had not offered Peast a job and had only returned to the pharmacy shortly after 8 p.m. as he had left his appointment book. Gacy promised to come to the station later that evening to make a statement, indicating he was unable to do so at that moment as his uncle had just died. When questioned as to how soon he could come to the police station, this asshole actually responded, "You guys are very rude. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" Speaking of the dead, as they questioned the belligerent Gacy in his easy chair, they were standing on 26 decomposing bodies, and Robert Peast was just a couple feet above their heads in the attic. That's a putrid sandwich right there. After promising to come to the station in an hour to fill out a statement, Gacy was rid of the police for the time being. He needed to get rid of Peast's body. During his confession, Gacy showed his completely twisted thought process for this time. After the cops left, he was so relieved they had not searched the house and found Peast. He had no thought of the other 26 bodies they would have found. Once they went to that crawl space, they ceased to exist in his mind. After badly missing his appointment at the police station, Gacy waited until the middle of the night, put Peast in the trunk of his car, and dumped him off a bridge into the Des Plaines River. He then promptly got stuck in the mud after sliding off an icy road. A passerby named Dennis Johnson, who happened to work for the toll authority, called him a tow truck. Gacy then had the audacity to tell this tow truck driver that he was a police officer and that he was on the way to investigate a murder. He had absolutely no reason to lie to this man. This is the mindset of this blowhard. Finally, at about 3:20 a.m., Gacy arrived at the police station covered in mud, claiming he had been involved in a car accident. Oh boy, now he was ready to fill out that statement and was surprised and put out because the lieutenant was not on duty. You're kidding, right? So if you're listening to this podcast at 3 a.m. and don't think this is weird, fucking go to bed. On returning to the police station later that day, Gacy denied any involvement in Peace's disappearance and repeated that he had not offered him a job. Gacy reiterated that he had returned to the pharmacy in response to a phone call from Torf, informing him he had left his appointment book there. Detectives had already spoken with Torf, who denied calling Gacy. At the request of detectives, Gacy prepared a written statement detailing his movements on December 11th. While this was going on, Kozenzak was briefing State's Attorney Terry Sullivan. They were still operating on the assumption that Gacy had kidnapped Peace and was possibly holding him in his house. They hastily wrote up a search warrant, and while they were waiting on a judge to sign it, the unlucky detective James Pickle got to stall Gacy by listening to him brag about himself. The first search warrant revealed several suspicious items, including several police badges, a starter pistol, probably used in a previous assault, a syringe and hypodermic needle, handcuffs, a book collection containing some of the classics like The American Bicentennial Gay Guy, The Great White Swallow, and Tight Teenagers. There were pornographic films, capsules of amyl nitrate, a dildo, a 2x4 with holes drilled into each end, bottles of Valium and atropine, several driver's license, a blue hooded parka, and underwear too small to fit Gacy's fat ass. They also found a class ring engraved with the initials JAS and a Nissan pharmacy photo receipt in a trash can, alongside a 36-inch section of nylon rope. Now, what they didn't find is Peace. And even though we can now look at this and, say fucking eureka, it would still take time to put all these pieces together. Remember, at this time, the police still just suspected Gacy of a single act of kidnapping and assault, at worst, possibly one murder. So now it's time for surveillance. The Des Plaines police confiscated Gacy's Oldsmobile and other PDM work vehicles. Surveillance teams, which consisted of officers Mike Albrecht, David Hockmeister, Ronald Robinson, and Robert Schultz, monitored Gacy as the investigation continued. The following day, the investigators received a phone call from Michael Rossi, who informed the investigators of Gregory Godzik's disappearance and the fact that another PDM employee, Charles Hatula, had been found drowned in the Illinois River earlier that year. On December 15th, Des Plaines investigators obtained further details of Gacy's battery charge, learning Jeffrey Rignall had reported that Gacy had lured him into the car, then chloroformed, raped, and tortured him before dumping him in Lincoln Park. In an interview with Gacy's former wife the same day, they learned of the disappearance of John Butkovich. The same day, the class ring was traced to John Allen Zick. An interview with Zick's mother revealed that several items from her son's apartment were also missing, including a Motorola television. Now, lots of things were starting to fall into place, and the police were seeing red flag after red flag. In fact, a Chinese national parade was starting to pale in comparison to this. How many people have you known in your entire lifetime that have gone missing for any extended period of time? I personally can't think of one, unless, of course, you count my ex-wives. But we're talking about Gacy right now. Every time the police turned around, Gacy was associated one way or another with a missing person. It was becoming mathematically impossible. By December 16th, Gacy was becoming affable with the surveillance detectives, regularly inviting them to join him for meals in restaurants and occasionally for drinks in bars or at his home. He repeatedly denied involvement with Peace's disappearance and accused the officers of harassing him because of his political connections or his recreational drug use. Knowing these officers were unlikely to arrest him on anything trivial, he taunted them by flouting traffic laws and succeeded in losing his pursuers more than once. That afternoon, Cram consented to a police interview in which he revealed that because of his poor timekeeping, Gacy had once given him a watch, explaining he got it from a dead person. I wonder if the syndicate can bail Gacy out of trouble this time. Investigators conducted a formal interview of Rossi on December 17th. He informed them Gacy had sold him Zick's vehicle, explaining that he had bought the car from Zick, because he needed money to move to California. A further examination of Gacy's Oldsmobile revealed a cluster of fibers in the trunk suspected to be human hair. That evening, 3 trained search dogs were used to determine whether Piest had been present in any of Gacy's vehicles. One laid on the passenger seat of Gacy's Oldsmobile, in what the dog's handler informed investigators was a death reaction, indicating Piest's body had been present. That evening, Gacy invited detectives Albrecht and Hockmester to a restaurant for a meal. On early December 18th, he invited them into another restaurant where, over breakfast, he discussed his business, his marriages, and his clowning. This was the conversation I mentioned earlier when Gacy remarked, clowns can get away with murder. By December 18th, Gacy was beginning to display signs of strain from the constant surveillance. He was unshaven, looked tired and anxious, and was drinking heavily. That afternoon, he drove to a lawyer's office to prepare a $750,000 civil suit against the Des Plaines police, demanding that they cease their surveillance. This lucky small-time lawyer who was about to become famous was Sam Amarante. He wasn't even Gacy's lawyer. They just traveled in the same political gathering circles. The same day, the Nissan Pharmacy photo receipt found in Gacy's kitchen was traced to 17-year-old Kimberly Byers, a colleague of Piest at Nissan Pharmacy. Byers stated that she had borrowed Piest's parka earlier in the evening and had placed the receipt in the pocket just before she returned to the coat to Piest as he left the store. This was fantastic luck. A photo receipt that actually had the assigned number 36119 was torn from its other half, which was still with Byers. Guess what? Perfect match to the tear. Now the second search warrant. The same evening, Rossi was interviewed a second time. This time, he was more cooperative. He informed detectives that in the summer of 1977, at Gacy's behest, he had spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of Gacy's house. On December 19th, investigators began compiling evidence for a second search warrant for Gacy's house. The same day, Gacy's lawyers filed a civil suit against the Des Plaines police. The hearing for the suit was scheduled for December 22nd. That afternoon, Gacy invited the surveillance detectives inside his house again. As Robinson distracted Gacy with conversation, Schultz walked into Gacy's bedroom in an unsuccessful attempt to write down the serial number of the Motorola television they suspected belonged to Zick. While flushing Gacy's toilet, the officer noticed that a smell he suspected could be that of rotting corpses emanating from a heating duct that had just activated. The officers who had searched Gacy's house previously had failed to notice this, as the house had been cold. Investigators interviewed both Cram and Rossi on December 20th. When questioned as to where he believed Gacy had concealed Piest's body, Rossi replied Gacy may have placed the body in the crawlspace. Rossi agreed to submit to a polygraph test. He denied any involvement in Piest's disappearance or any knowledge of his whereabouts. He soon refused to continue the questioning, and Rossi's erratic and inconsistent responses while attached to the polygraph machine rendered Kozenczak unable to render a definite opinion as to his truthfulness. Rossi did, however, further discuss the trench digging he did in the crawlspace and remarked on Gacy's insistence that he not deviate from where he was instructed to dig. Cram informed investigators of Gacy's attempt to rape him in 1976. He stated that after he and Gacy had returned to his home after the December 13th search, Gacy had turned pale after seeing a clod of mud on his carpet and had immediately entered the crawlspace to look for evidence of digging. When asked whether he had been to the crawlspace, Cram replied he had once been asked by Gacy to spread lime down there and had also dug trenches, which Gacy had explained were for drainage pipes. Cram stated these trenches were 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep. Sound familiar, right? It's graves. Now to the confession. On the evening of December 20th, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office in Park Ridge to attend a scheduled meeting, ostensibly to discuss the progress of the civil suit. Gacy appeared anxious and disheveled and immediately asked for an alcoholic drink. Sam Amarante fetched a bottle of Seagram's whiskey, and Gacy immediately drank 2 cupfuls. Amarante, by this stage, was dubious of Gacy's claims of innocence. He then asked what he had to discuss with him, placing a copy of the Daily Herald on his desk and stating, "You said you had something new to tell me, something important." Gacy picked up the newspaper, pointed to the front page article covering the disappearance of Piest and said, "This boy is dead. He's dead. He's in a river." Gacy then proceeded to give a rambling confession that ran into the early hours of the following morning. He began by stating that he had been the judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people, and that he now wanted to be the same for himself. He stated he had murdered at least 30 victims, most of whom he had buried in his crawl space, and had disposed of 5 of their bodies in the Des Plaines River. Now, unlike some serial killers who guard their kill count till the grave, I tend to believe Gacy's estimate here for 2 reasons. 1, he was uninhibited with alcohol and drugs at this time, and 2, an egotistical blowhard like him would jump all over this opportunity to brag about himself. Even Gacy was smart enough to know that whether it was 1 or 100 victims, he was cooked. Why not claim more? Gacy dismissed his victims as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars, adding he sometimes awoke to find dead, strangled kids with their hands cuffed behind their back. Personally, after a crazy night, I usually woke to find no one had used coasters for their drinks. This was also probably the same importance Gacy assigned these troublesome dead bodies. He stated he had buried their bodies in his crawl space as he dementedly believed they were now his property. Now, as a result of the alcohol he had consumed, Gacy fell asleep midway through this confession. Amarante finally realized the gravity of the situation, immediately switched to lawyer mode, and arranged a psychiatric appointment for Gacy that morning. On awakening several hours later, Gacy shook his head when informed by Amarante that he had confessed to killing approximately 30 people. So he says, "Well, I can't think about this right now. I've got things to do." Now, ignoring the lawyer's advice regarding his scheduled appointment, Gacy left to attend to his business. Now, this can be one of the times that the rules of our justice system have the potential to do much more harm than good. Amarante now knows his client is the worst killer in American history at this time. He knows the danger to the public that Gacy represents once he leaves his office. But Amarante also has a legal duty to his client not to provide evidence against him. I'm not a lawyer, but I believe if Amarante had been more experienced, he could have found a way to better handle the situation. What he did do was to tell the surveillance detectives who were following Gacy to not let him leave. Judges and prosecutors can snap their fingers and have people detained without explanation, but defense attorneys can't. Here's how my small brain imagines this conversation went. Amarante, don't let Gacy leave. Detectives, why not? Amarante, I can't tell you, but trust me. Detectives, trusted defense attorney? Yeah, right. Hey, Gacy, wait up. The detectives already perfectly knew well that Gacy was a potentially dangerous person. This was one of the reasons for the 24-hour surveillance. But for every action a detective takes in a situation like this, not the defense, the detectives have to consider its consequences all the way through the end of any upcoming trial. Every little mistake they make has the potential of losing a life or death case. The term walking on eggshells doesn't even come close to covering it. Now, because of this adversarial process between prosecution and defense, and it's ideally in place to protect the innocent from wrongful convictions, the hyper-guilty like Gacy take full advantage and benefit of it. Gacy later recollected his memories of his final day of freedom as being hazy, adding he knew his arrest was inevitable and that he intended to visit his friends and say his farewells. After leaving his lawyer's office, Gacy drove to a gas station where he handed a small bag of weed to the attendant, who immediately handed the bag over to the surveillance officers, adding that Gacy had told him, "The end is coming for me, and these guys are going to kill me." Gacy then drove to the home of a fellow contractor and friend, Ronald Rode. Gacy hugged Rode before bursting into tears and saying, "I've been a bad boy. I killed 30 people, give or take a few." Gacy left Rode and drove to Cram's home to meet with Cram and Rossi. The surveillance officers noted he was holding a rosary to his chin, praying while he drove along the expressway, probably at 100 miles an hour. After talking with Cram and Rossi, Gacy had Cram drive him to a scheduled legal meeting. Cram informed the surveillance officers that Gacy had told him and Rossi that he had confessed to over 30 murders with his lawyers the previous evening. Gacy then had Cram drive to Mary Hill Cemetery, where his father was buried. As Gacy drove to various locations that morning, police outlined the formal draft of their second search warrant, specifically to search for Peace's body in the crawl space. On hearing from the surveillance detectives that, in light of his erratic behavior, Gacy might be about to commit suicide, police decided to arrest him on a charge of possession and distribution of cannabis in order to hold him in custody until the formal request for the second search warrant was presented. At 4:30 p.m. on December 21st, the eve of the hearing of Gacy's civil suit, a second search warrant was granted. After police informed Gacy of their intention to search his crawl space for the body of Peast, Gacy denied the teenager was buried there, but confessed to having killed in self-defense a young man whose body was buried under his garage. Armed with a signed search warrant, police and evidence technicians drove to Gacy's home. They found Gacy had unplugged his sump pump, flooding the crawl space with water. They replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. Evidence technician Daryl Genty, who was so unlucky he must have been related to Eric with a K, the Viking evidence technician from the Jeffrey Dahmer case, then entered the 28 by 38 foot crawl space, crawled to the southwest area, and began digging in the rancid muck. Within minutes, he uncovered a putrefied human flesh wrapped around an arm bone. Upon seeing this grisly sight, Genty urgently shouted to the investigators, "Charge him, murder." And then, to the horror of everyone not currently neck-deep in shit with him, "I think this place is full of kids." A police photographer uncovered a patella in the northeast corner. The two then began digging in the southeast corner, uncovering 2 lower leg bones. The victims were too composed to be pieced. As the body in the northeast corner was unearthed, the crime scene technician discovered the skull of a second victim alongside this body. Later excavations of the feet in this second victim revealed a further skull beneath the body. Because of this, technicians returned to the trench where the first body was unearthed, discovering the rib cage of a fourth victim, confirming the end-up scale of these murders. Now the arrest. After being informed that the police had found human remains in his crawl space and that he would now face murder charges, Gacy told officers he wanted to clear the air, because he is such a good, upstanding guy. In the early morning hours of December 22nd, and in the presence of his lawyers, Gacy provided a formal statement in which he confessed to murdering approximately 30 young males. Remember this for later. He was not coerced or questioned. He voluntarily confessed. Some victims were referred to by name, but Gacy claimed not to know or remember most of the names. He claimed all were teenage male runaways or male prostitutes, the majority of whom he had buried in his crawl space. Gacy claimed to have dug only 5 of the graves in this location and had his employees, including Godzik, dig the remaining trenches so that he would have graves available. When shown a driver's license issued to a Robert Haston, which had been found on his property, Gacy claimed not to know him, but admitted that this license had been in the possession of one of his victims. In January 1979, he had planned to conceal the corpses even further by covering the entire crawl space with concrete. When questioned specifically about Peast, Gacy confessed to luring him to his house and strangling him on December 11th. He also admitted to having slept alongside Peast's body that evening before disposing of the corpse in the Des Plaines River. Accompanied by police, his lawyers, and his older sister, Gacy was driven to the I-55 bridge on December 23rd to pinpoint the precise spot where he confessed to having thrown the body of Robert Peast and 4 other victims into the river. Gacy was then taken to his house and instructed to mark his garage floor with orange spray paint to show where he had buried the individual he had supposedly killed in self-defense, whom he named as John Butkovich. To assist officers in their search, Gacy drew a rough diagram of his basement to indicate where the bodies were buried. 26 bodies were unearthed from Gacy's crawl space over the next week. 3 others were also unearthed elsewhere on his property. As the flooding and walls of the property were dismantled, the flooring and walls of the property were dismantled, additional evidence including identification cards and further deviant sex books were discovered. Now to the trial. Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, charged with 33 murders. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois, before Judge Louis Garipo. The jury was selected from Rockford because of the extensive press coverage in Cook County. At the request of his defense counsel, Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester in the year before his trial. He underwent a variety of psychological tests to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. In a not at all surprising twist, Gacy attempted to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. Now imagine Gacy wakes up in his cell and knows he has another meeting with a psychiatrist today. Up until now, he hasn't displayed any sign of schizophrenia at all. In fact, the last time he was evaluated years ago, he was just given the clinical label for egotistical dickhead. But when he walks into the room with a shrink today, he's not alone. Gacy brought 4 buddies with him. The hardworking, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and a policeman called Jack Handley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack. It's convenient that he can only provide a name for the bad cop who he wished to blame for everything. Incorporating 3 other names and personalities into this bucket of bullshit would have been far too much for Gacy's so-called intellect. What happens in this exam room today, I like to equate to having a supremely untalented buddy who drags you to his acting improv class. So now you get to sit there and cringe so hard that you literally pull a muscle as Gacy performs. And I am no shit talking complete with physical pantomime. Have you ever seen Philip Seymour Hoffman's character Sandy Lyle in the movie Along Came Polly? This is it, except without a shred of comedic talent. Now, I'm going to wash my mouth out with whiskey for mentioning Hoffman's name in reference to Gacy. Hoff is one of my all-time favorites. So rest in peace and white chocolate, brother. When Gacy had confessed to police, he claimed to be relaying the crimes of Jack, who detested homosexuality and viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degraded scum. It's not at all ironic that Gacy assigned the role of this evil personality to the authority figure, the cop. He had always had the annoying habit of verbally degrading anyone who was not completely on his side. For example, his discussion of any particular detective or prosecutor was invariably prefaced with the asshole. I'm sure most of us know the mentally microscopic person who can only build themselves up by demeaning and bad-mouthing others. And have I continually demeaned and bad-mouthed Gacy during this podcast? Yeah. Well, make that what you will, the assholes. Ultimately, his lawyers opted to have Gacy plead not guilty by reason of insanity. In a shit case like this, with a loudmouth moron for a client and a full confession, Almirante had little choice. Even in his opening statement, one of Gacy's defense attorneys, Robert Motta, remarked, "The insanity defense has been looked upon as an escape, a defense of last resort." He then immediately followed that up with this backhanded and completely expected bullshit statement. "The defense of insanity is valid, and it is the only defense that we could use here because that is where the truth lies. Because if Gacy is normal, then our concept of normality is totally distorted." Basically telling the jury that if they didn't rule in his favor, they were evil and thought serial killing was normal. They presented Gacy as a Jekyll and Hyde character. The defense produced several psychiatric experts who had examined Gacy. 3 testified that they found him to be paranoid schizophrenic with multiple personalities. I will never understand how these 3 experts can look at themselves in the mirror. I have to believe that they are merely greedy, unscrupulous people who only care about collecting a paycheck and possibly getting their name in print. I also have to believe that they truly think Gacy is sane and guilty, but that no matter what they say, he will be put away, so they're not responsible. The prosecutors argued that Gacy was sane and in full control of his actions. They produced several witnesses to testify to his premeditation and the efforts he took to escape detection. Those doctors refuted the defense doctors' claims of multiple personalities and insanity. Crom and Rossi testified that Gacy had made them dig drainage trenches and spread bags of lime in his crawlspace. Both said Gacy looked periodically into the crawlspace to ensure they and other employees they supervised did not deviate from the precise locations he had marked. On February 18th, Robert Stein testified that all the bodies recovered from Gacy's property were markedly decomposed and putrefied skeletalized remains, and that all of the autopsies he performed, 13 victims had died of asphyxiation, 6 of ligature strangulation, 1 of multiple stab wounds to the chest, and 10 in undetermined ways. When Gacy's defense team suggested that all 33 deaths were caused by accidental erotic asphyxia, Stein called this, and I quote, "fucking stupid." I'm of course kidding. He said highly improbable. Jeffrey Rignall testified on February 21st. Rignall wept repeatedly while describing Gacy's torture of him in March of '78. During specific cross-examinations relating to the torture, Rignall vomited, and he was in such a wretched state he was eventually excused from further testimony. On February 29th, Donald Voorhees testified to his ordeal at Gacy's hands and his assault at Gacy's behest. Voorhees felt unable to testify but did briefly attempt to do so before being asked to step down. Robert Donnelly testified the week after Voorhees, recounting his ordeal at Gacy's hands in December of '77. Donnelly was visibly distressed as he recalled the abuse. Without being in the courtroom, are you seeing a pattern starting to form here? Gacy's butchered 33 people, and it's beginning to appear that they were the lucky ones. These people who just spent a short time receiving Patches the Clown's special attention are so damaged that they will suffer for the rest of their lives. Now, during the 5th week of the trial, Gacy wrote a personal letter to Judge Garippo. Not a professional letter composed and edited by his trained legal team. No, Gacy believed he was so smart and clever, he could just slip this judge, his good buddy and peer, a note. The letter, which I imagine was written in crayon, requested a mistrial for the reasons including that he did not approve of his lawyer's insanity plea, that his lawyers had not allowed him to take the witness stand as he had wanted to do, that his defense had not called enough medical witnesses, and that the police were lying with regard to verbal statements he had allegedly made to detectives after his arrest, and that in any event the statements were self-serving for use by the prosecution. These soap opera reasons had to make Judge Garippo quietly chuckle to himself in his chambers, especially the part where a big bad prosecutor used Gacy's self-incriminating statements in a self-serving manner. Now, after wiping his eyes, the judge promptly informed Gacy that both counsels had been given the opportunity and funds to summon expert witnesses to testify, and that under the law, he had the choice whether he wished to testify, and was free to indicate as much to the judge. And guess what? After being told this, did the super smart and always in charge John Wayne Gacy leap up and take the stand to tell his side of the story? No. He continued to sit in that chair, looking suspiciously like Humpty Dumpty, just waiting for the fall. Now the closing arguments. On March 11th, final arguments by both prosecution and defense attorneys began. Prosecuting attorney Harry Sullivan outlined Gacy's history of abusing youths, the testimony of his efforts to avoid detection, and describing his surviving victims Voorhees and Donnelly as living dead. That was an apt description. He referred to Gacy as the worst of all murderers. Sullivan stated, John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all. After the state's 4-hour closing, counsel Sam Amarante spoke for the defense. Amarante accused Sullivan of scarcely referring to the evidence in his own closing statement and of arousing hatred against his client, that poor guy. He attempted to portray Gacy as driven by compulsions he was unable to control, contending the state had not met their burden of proving Gacy sane beyond a reasonable doubt. Amarante then urged the jury to put aside any prejudice they held against his client and asked they deliver a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, adding that Gacy was a danger to both himself and to others, and that studying his psychology and behavior would be of benefit to science. On the morning of March 12th, William Kunkel continued to argue for the prosecution. Kunkel referred to the defense's contention of insanity as a sham, arguing that the facts of the case demonstrated Gacy's ability to think logically and control his actions. Kunkel also referred to the testimony of one of the doctors who had examined Gacy in 1968 and had concluded he was an antisocial personality, stating that had the recommendation of this doctor been heeded, Gacy would not have been freed. In a dramatic highlight of the case, Kunkel had the actual cutout entrance to Gacy's crawl space wheeled in front of the jury box. At the close of his argument, Kunkel removed photos of Gacy's 22 identified victims from a display board and asked the jury not to show sympathy but to show justice. He then forcefully threw the photos into the crawl space. This obviously drew an emotional response from the jury members, and later, Amarante even stated, "I knew it was over then." The jury deliberated for just 1 hour and 50 minutes. The legal teams had gone to a nearby bar to await the verdict and probably didn't even have a buzz yet. Anyway, no shock at all. Gacy was found guilty of 33 charges of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child, both in reference to Robert Piest. At the time, his conviction for 33 murders was the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted. In the sentencing phase of the trial, the jury deliberated for more than 2 hours before sentencing Gacy to death for each murder committed after the Illinois statute on capital punishment came into effect in June 1977. His execution was set for June 2, 1980. A clown on death row. On being sentenced, Gacy was transferred to the Menard Correctional Center where he remained on death row for 14 years. Isolated in his prison cell, Gacy began to paint. He drew inspiration from a wide range of sources for his artwork, depicting subjects as diverse as clowns, including himself as Pogo or Patches, Christ, birds, skulls, his own home, and for some reason John Dillinger. Gacy's paintings have been displayed at exhibitions and sold at auction. Before his trial, Gacy initiated contact with journalist Russ Ewing, to whom he granted numerous interviews between 1979 and 1981. Ewing later collaborated with author Tim Cahill to publish the book Buried Dreams. I used this book heavily in my research, mostly to show the duplicity Gacy showed before and after his conviction. The information Gacy divulged to Ewing regarding the circumstances of his first murder would prove instrumental in establishing the identity of his first victim, Tim McCoy. On February 15, 1983, Henry Brisbane, a fellow death row inmate known as the I-57 killer, stabbed Gacy in the arm with a sharpened wire. Outside of some jelly loss or whatever the fuck clowns use for blood, he received minor treatment in the prison hospital and was released. After his incarceration, Gacy read law books and filed voluminous motions and appeals, although he did not prevail in any. His appeals related to issues such as the validity of the first search warrant granted to the Des Plaines Police Department on December 13, 1978, and his objection to his lawyer's insanity plea defense. This shit again. Gacy, you fucking performed as 4 different split personalities. As the immortal poet Bob Wiley stated, roses are red, violets are blue. I'm a schizophrenic, and so am I. Gacy contended that, although he had some knowledge of 5 of the murders, those of McCoy, Butkovich, Godzik, Zick, and Piest, the other 28 murders had been committed by employees who had keys to his house while he was away on business trips. In mid-1984, the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld Gacy's conviction and ordered his execution by lethal injection on November 14th. Gacy filed an appeal against this decision, which was denied by the Supreme Court of the United States on March 4, 1985. The following year, Gacy filed a further post-conviction petition seeking a new trial. His then defense lawyer, Richard Kling, argued that Gacy had been provided with ineffective legal counsel at his 1980 trial. This petition was dismissed on September 11, 1986. Gacy appealed the 1985 decision that he be executed. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld his conviction on September 29, 1988, setting a new execution date of January 11, 1989. After the U.S. Supreme Court denied Gacy's final appeal in October 1993, the Illinois Supreme Court finally set an execution date for May 10, 1994. So after that string of bullshit, you now see why people who should have rode the lightning long ago sit on death row for 20 years, literally an entire generation. They file a last-minute appeal based on grasping at straws. The legal system grinds to a halt and takes years to decide that those straws are actually dipped in shit. Then, so as not to appear cruel to the murder of 33 innocents, they don't immediately end him. They set a new date months from now, presumably so he can get his grubby hand on a new set of dipping sticks. Now, while sitting there talking about this, I'm thinking about my last 2 podcasts, Albert Fish and Jeffrey Dahmer, and how those stories ended. Fish was executed pretty expeditiously thanks to a much older and stricter legal system. And Dahmer, instead of a nice long life sentence, he was beaten to death, funnily enough, by another inmate who was actually schizophrenic. This has inspired me in regards to the subject of our next podcast. For all its other flaws, you will see how that legal system handles swift justice. But I digress for now. So the balloon finally bursts. On the morning of May 9th, 1994, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his last meal, Gacy ordered, you guessed it, a bucket of KFC, French fries, a dozen deep-fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke, counting calories and watching his figure to the end. That evening, he received the last rites from a Catholic priest before being escorted to the Stateville execution chamber. In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, a crowd estimated over 1,000 gathered outside the correctional center. Vocal majority were in favor of the execution, although a small number of anti-death penalty protesters were present. Some of those in favor of the execution wore t-shirts hearkening to Gacy's previous community services as a clown and bearing satirical slogans such as "No Tears for the Clown." Before the execution began, the chemicals used to effect the execution solidified unexpectedly, clogging the IV tube. I still bet the jelly had something to do with it. The execution team replaced the clogged tube and the execution resumed. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists blamed the problem on the prison officials' inexperience at conducting an execution. This error apparently led to Illinois adopting an alternative method of lethal injection. One prosecutor at Gacy's trial, William Kunkel, said he got a much easier death than any of his victims. According to published reports, Gacy was a diagnosed psychopath who did not express any remorse for his crimes. His final statement to his lawyer before his execution was that killing him would not compensate for the loss of others and that the state was murdering him. Poor little Gacy. I guess deep down he really was a nice guy and thought murder was wrong. Yeah, that's good, John. Good guess. And once again, thanks to I Don't Give a Shit About the Truth journalists, his final spoken words were reported to be, "Kiss my ass." William Kunkel stated in 2020 that these words were spoken to a prison official and were not part of any official statement prior to Gacy's execution. I imagine, out of terror in his last minutes, his speech to all around him was laced with expletives, such as the always classic, "Holy shit, I'm about to die." After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10th, 1994, his brain was removed. It's in the possession of Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at Gacy's trial who's interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. You may not recognize her name, but if you've ever seen a serial killer documentary, chances are she was one of the experts in it. Anyway, Gacy's body was cremated. The mortuary worker told reporters that the process smelled like cotton candy. Well, I'm getting my leg up on my degree in journalism, you assholes. I found one last interesting note at the end of the Wikipedia page that I thought bared mentioning. In 1984, Sam Amarante authored procedures that were incorporated by the Illinois General Assembly into the Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984. At the time of Gacy's murders, Illinois police had to wait 72 hours before initiating a search for a missing child or adolescent, which seems ludicrous. The Missing Child Recovery Act removed this waiting period. Other states subsequently adopted similar procedures. As a result, a national network aimed at locating missing children was gradually formed. This has since developed into the Child Abduction Emergency Alert, commonly known as the Amber Alert. So, you rape and murder 33 kids. But at least this slaps the system in the face and makes it realize how insane some of its processes are. It's reactionary till the very end. Well, I see that Gacy has cleaned out every protein on the buffet table. Let's send him back to hell with a full stomach. Say hi to Fish and Dahmer for us. Okay, I'm glad that's over. Now, I want you to go take a shower or bath or Febreze yourself, whatever you do to disinfect those hard-to-reach places slimy discussions like this creep into. Go ahead. I'll wait and sit here continuing talking to myself. Now, if you're one of those people who don't wash, then I guess I can share a memory that just came to me while we wait for everyone else. During one of the last nights of preparing this script, I ended up plopped on the couch watching a movie. My 3.5-year-old granddaughter then comes into the living room to tell me goodnight, as it was her bedtime. She tells me to lean over so she can whisper in my ear. She's at this stage where telling secrets is cool, and it's also a delaying technique to keep her out of bed. I lean over, expecting to hear some nonsensical about dinosaurs, or her just saying shh, which she thinks is a secret. Instead, she whispers, "There are zombies in your work office." She then pulls back, looks at me for an uncomfortably long 2 seconds, smiles, and runs off to bed. Now, I'm sure the zombie stuff was from one of her cartoons, Hotel Transylvania or something, and in recent months I have spent a lot of time in my office. But the more I think about it, the more she's right. Since I began researching and writing these podcasts, I've thought more about death and killing than I have in more than 2 decades of being in law enforcement. Anyway, I'll be keeping an eye on that kid. So, it seems our hygienically sound folks are back from their suspiciously long showers. Well, now everybody throw on your parkas. Next time, we're off on a long trip to a place that's cold, bleak, and has just a hint of communism. I'll let you speculate on it until I release an image on social media before the next podcast. Thank you all so much for sitting here and listening to me ramble. This is your host, Brian, saying, everybody be good and behave, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Mad Cardigan Crime.